about 6 months after I graduated from high school. I enlisted for 3 years. I had 2 ideas when I went in. One of those ideas was possibly making the military a career. The other one was if I decided I didn't like the military as a career, I wanted some education to maybe help me in life afterwards. I signed up on guaranteed schooling to become an aircraft mechanic. And I did that. I went to school after going through basic training to become a helicopter mechanic on Huey helicopters. After that, I went to Vietnam, and I spent a year in Vietnam. Shortly after I got to my unit, I became what was called a night shift flight line mechanic. I went to work at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and got off when all our work was done. That could have been at 10 o'clock at night or maybe 8 o'clock the next morning when day shift came to work. We were responsible for the aircraft that were flying. When they came in from the day of flying, anything that needed to be fixed so they could fly the next day, that's what we took care of. There were a lot of day shift mechanics, and when the aircraft, we couldn't fix them out on the flight line, they'd go to the, it's called a hangar, or a big garage, to be repaired, or every so many hours they had to go in for what was called preventive maintenance. And they had crews that worked in there on that. But I basically worked out on the flight line, fixing stuff to be ready to fly the next day. Now there were certain things that, or certain jobs that we did on the aircraft that required a test flight. And test pilots were pretty picky. If the mechanic that did repairs wouldn't fly, he wouldn't fly. So the mechanics that worked the night shift on the flight line, you had to be willing to fly and trust your own work that the aircraft was going to stay in the air. Because if you didn't trust your work, the test pilot wouldn't trust it. And those aircraft had to be fixed before the sun went down, because we had to have test flights in before the sun went down. So those were our first jobs that we would do. I also was a standby door gunner crew chief, but I worked 6 days a week. So the one day that I had off really didn't let me have too many opportunities to fly as a door gunner or crew chief. Our unit, we flew, part of our aircraft flew from another base, and they flew the 173rd Airborne Rangers, and the other half of our unit flew soldiers that we called ROKs, and they were Republic of Korea soldiers. Those were our 2 primary groups of soldiers that we flew. After spending a year in Vietnam, I came back to the States and was sent to Fort Hood, Texas, where I learned a new career in the military, and they put me in what was called Air Defense Artillery. And we shot, well, they were called Vulcan cannons. I don't know if you guys are familiar with like a minigun or a Gatling gun.
Yeah, we are.
These were big miniguns. They shot 20 millimeter shells. So right now it's kind of hard for me to tell you how big a 20mm bullet is, but that's the size of ammunition these guns shot, and they shot 2,000 rounds a minute. And I watched a show this last year on television about the aircraft carriers that the Navy has now. They have these same guns on them, and they're computerized now. And now they shoot over 3,000 rounds a minute. But I spent 1.5 years in Texas doing that, and decided that military life was not the life for me, and I got out. I grew up in Grand Junction, and I went back to there. There wasn't any work to say in Grand Junction in 1973. They were starting to build the Craig power plants and the second Hayden power plant, and I came up here and got on to doing that. And then a couple of years later, I got on at a surface coal mine running heavy equipment, and that's what I did for the next 35 years until I retired 4 years ago. And that's just a little bit short and sweet of what I did and my 3 years in the military. Mrs. Blakeman asked me to bring a picture of myself when I was in the Army. That's over here. And the other box is a shadow box that I made. It has some of my stuff. This is a patch that I wore when I was in Texas for the unit I was in. This one was for when I was in Vietnam, the battalion I was in. My dog tags, medals that I made that while I was in the military. These two were presented by the Vietnam government, the South Vietnamese government, and they are what's called unit citations. The red and yellow one was for gallantry in battle against the enemy, and that was mostly for our helicopter crews, but because the guys out there doing the fighting need support work and people to make sure they can do what they do, that's why it went to the whole unit. The green and red one was for civilian action, and what that was for is we did a lot of work helping the civilians in our area, building schools or all sorts of different things that we did to help the civilians in the area, and that's what that one was for. This red and yellow one is National Defense Ribbon or medal, and when you go into the military you get those. This yellow and red and green one was Vietnam campaign. That was presented by the U.S. government. The green and white one was also a Vietnam service medal that was awarded to soldiers from the Vietnamese government. And the last one is the Army Good Conduct medal. And that one you had to serve at least 3 years in the Army to get and not get in any trouble. These two blue patches down at the bottom were patches that we wore on our shirt pockets in the unit that I was in Vietnam. It was Lucky Star, was the name of our unit, and our helicopter pilots, they would come up with a name or whatever for themselves on the radio, but it was usually Lucky Star something. And that the Lucky Star identified our unit. Our unit was also called the 61st Assault Helicopter Company. You got a pair of dice down here. One of them has 6 and one of them has 1 for the 61st. my dog tags, my weapons qualification badges, and then this other one I received when I was in Fort Hood, Texas, and that was driver mechanic, and for track and wheeled vehicles. Okay. I will take questions now, but what I ask, and Mrs. Blakeman, if you could help at times, my hearing is not very good. Part of it is due to my military service, and part of it is due to me operating heavy equipment for the last 35 years.
It's gotta get
I
loud.
do wear hearing aids, and I wore hearing protection most of those years. But it isn't real good. So just take your time, speak up a little bit, and help me out. And if I can't quite understand them, if you could
Sure.
help, and I'd be appreciated, and I'll answer any and all the questions you guys have.
They're used to me and I don't hear well. Would you like to have us, make yourself comfortable and have
You bet.
a seat?
Take the pumpkin
Isaiah
back. Take the pumpkin.
here has the first question.
Okay.
Were you drafted or they
I enlisted.
What was your job?
I was not drafted. I enlisted. They had, back then, what was called a delayed entry program. I graduated from high school the end of May, and I came up here to Craig and worked in the hayfields, doing custom haying. That fall I got out, or we were done, and the guy that I worked for lived in Florida. I went home for a couple of days. I enlisted in the Army on delayed entry. That was in September. Went to Florida with him for 2 weeks and then came back to Grand Junction, went out to my old high school and lifted weights and got in shape, and went into the Army in November and got there the week before Thanksgiving. Okay?